Coming to you from the big island of Hawaii, it's the Songs and Stories Podcast. And now, here's your host, Steve Roby.
My special guest today is noted jazz pianist Aaron Goldberg. Welcome to the Kahilu Theatre.
Thanks, Steve.
All right. Yeah. Hey, well, let's start at the beginning. Let's talk about your introduction to jazz. When did it start, and who were your influences?
So I began playing piano when I was about 6 or 7 years old. My parents had a piano in the house. They played when they were kids, but classical music. No, there was no jazz in the house, unfortunately. But I got very fortunate. I went to a high school where there happened to be a math teacher by day who was a jazz bass player by night.
Oh, wow.
And he probably spent a few too many nights out doing his real job, his night job, and maybe not correcting students' math papers.
Oh.
So pretty soon he realized that maybe he should try to convince the school to let him teach jazz instead of math. To my eternal credit and good fortune, they said yes, and he began a jazz improvisation class.
Nice.
For people like me who had zero jazz background, all you needed to do to enroll in the class was play an instrument of any kind at any level. And it focused on small group improvisation. A lot of high school programs in America that do have jazz, they focus on big bands. So this was a pretty unique experience that I would never have gotten any other high school.
Nice.
What I've learned now as a professional jazz musician, 30 years later, is that most of the American jazz musicians that I know all went to the same small number of high schools. Maybe 50 out of the 10,000 high schools in America are producing all the jazz musicians because those 50 high schools have an amazing teacher like my high school teacher. So I owe him everything. His name is Bob Sinecrope.
All right.
And this small number of amazing teachers are producing the next generation of artists, and we all owe them so much. So he taught us, basically he gave us a cassette. This is the late 80s. So I had my Maxell cassette with 8 jazz songs on it. Some Miles Davis, some classic Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers, some Herbie Hancock, and I got hooked. We got a little note in the mail with this cassette that said, homework for fall jazz class, listen to this cassette. So I was a good student, so I listened to the cassette. I didn't know if I was supposed to listen to it once or 1,000 times. I listened to it 1,000 times, and I got hooked until I could sing all the solos. And I didn't really understand that it was improvised music. It took years to figure out how it was possible to improvise music, to make it up on the spot and make it sound great.
Nice.
But these were the masters on the cassette, so basically I learned the way that I learned to speak English by copying the people that did it better than me. And those happened to be, Miles Davis and Coltrane and Herbie.
The icons.
The icons, yeah.
Yeah. When did you decide to turn jazz into a professional career?
That's such a great question. I always get this question, and the honest answer is I feel like I never decided. I feel like I'm still deciding every day that this is, something I want to, give my entire self to, which, makes it a great marriage, right? Like it's that one that you renew every day with commitment. I never thought it was possible. I never imagined that I would become good enough to do it for a living. What I did know is that I wanted to get off the train that was taking me to medical school or law school, the train that my parents put you on. I knew that I wanted to choose my life. And after high school I went to New York. I was 17. That was where everything was happening, early 90s. I enrolled at a great school called the New School for Jazz and Contemporary Music. And the idea of the New School was to teach jazz in an academic setting that wasn't too academic. So it was more of like trying to pass along the oral tradition, the way these masters has learned before there were any jazz schools.
Sure.
They learned by hanging out, kind of the way that Indian classical musicians learn, apprenticeship with a master. And so we would spend time with these older musicians in a classroom, but not exactly doing homework. And we, the tradition was kind of passed along to us, the students. That's a unique vision of how jazz education should go. It doesn't really exist anywhere else.
Right.
It doesn't even exist at the New School anymore. But the founders of the New School had this idea of let's try to accredit an institution that teaches jazz, not in a Berklee College of Music kind of formalized way, but in an informal way. And we would just go around asking each other, hey, what are you listening to? What are you copying? What are you checking out? And just trying to learn songs by ear.
Right.
Exactly the way that Miles and Coltrane learned. And I spent an amazing year there. I ran out of money after that. But I realized I now knew how to teach myself how to get better.
Right.
And all I needed was a community of musicians to hang out with. So at that point, I went back and made my parents happy and studied philosophy and psychology at a liberal arts school and just played as much as I could by night. So I became kind of like my jazz teacher, living, double life, day and night.
Hey, speaking of music education, you're doing a special segment for some of the local schools with Kahilu TV's live stream. I know you talked a lot about music education, but is there a certain message you want to get across to some of the local students here that...
Yeah, I'm really curious to know if the local students here have any experience with jazz of any kind, right? I mean, I know that I wouldn't have if I hadn't had the good fortune to go to the school. I do know in Honolulu that there's some programs for kids, and some of the kids actually fly to Honolulu. The Youth Symphony runs a program for classical and jazz, and some of the kids fly from Big Island and Maui. So I know they're out here. I know that there's some jazz students out here.
Well, we've got the Honoka'a Jazz Band just down the road. There's a Grammy Award-winning teacher there, Gary Washburn, who's going to be here at the theater in a couple of weeks. So there are some jazz enthusiasts that are of that age there. So
amazing. So I mean, my message is, if you want to really improve at this music, the right way to learn is the way that the masters learned, and you're not going to really get it from any piece of paper or any classroom setting. You're going to get it by listening and copying what you hear.
Yeah.
And the most important thing, if you want to really speak any language fluently, is to listen to it all the time. And what's going to make you listen to it all the time? Falling in love with it. So it all comes down to how much you love the music. If you fall in love with this music, you're going to want to listen all the time. Suddenly you're going to become a better and more fluent speaker of the language, and improvisation is going to move from being a mystery, a total impossibility, to something that you're actually doing. In the same way that I'm making up what I'm saying right now as I'm going along. I'm not reading off of any script. We actually have the ability as human beings to improvise in musical language or in verbal language. So the skill set is actually quite related, I think. People don't realize that because they tend to learn instruments from a paper. They tend to learn off of a page. But I doubt that the Hawaiian tradition is like that. I imagine it's an oral tradition as well, at least originally. So.
Well, that kind of leads into a transition to my next question. Doing preparation for this interview, I noticed that you've traveled the world and you've experienced different types of musical genres and in different countries and everything like that. And what fascinated me was that you merged some of that into the music you play and compose. Can you talk about that?
The one element in my life that I didn't really imagine was the ability to get to see the world playing this music that I love. And in fact, jazz musicians, we go on tour. In part for financial necessity, but in part because we love to spread this art form all around the world. And fortunately, jazz is an international music. There's not a large jazz audience out there, but there's a very, very, very intensely loyal jazz audience in almost every country in the world. There's at least a couple of jazz lovers. And in places like Japan and Europe, there are a lot of jazz lovers.
Right?
So, once I started to tour in the late 90s, I got an opportunity to go to, over 90 countries. And often what you find when you go to places like, in particular, Brazil, Cuba, Haiti, Colombia, also India, that there's so much amazing local music.
Right.
We would call it world music here. It's not American music, but it's amazing. It's amazing music. So it's hard not to fall in love with some. If you go to Brazil, you can't help but fall in love.
Some of it rubs off, right?
Brazilian music. So and it's a whole deep tradition, as deep and complex and powerful as our own African American jazz tradition. And I found myself, getting pulled into it, getting sucked in deeper. I wanted to learn, who is this Brazilian artist? Who played with this guy? Who influenced this guy? Suddenly I'm studying it the way I'm studying, who influenced Herbie Hancock, who influenced Red Garland, taking jazz history back. I'm now taking, Brazilian music back. So then I start getting interested in salsa. Where did son come from? And pretty soon you realize, wait a second, I can't get good at everything. I need to figure out, who am I? So I've been trying to experiment with, taking folk musics from different parts of the world and bringing them into a kind of New York jazz context. So using them as vehicles for improvisation, not imitating a Brazilian style, not imitating a Cuban style or an Indian style, but playing in our style, our improvisational language, our, let's say, like communicative discourse, our way of talking to each other. with our accent, but their like source material, their melodic material, their song forms and song traditions, and experimenting with with that kind of crossover.
Nice, nice.
It's not quite a fusion in the way that we used to think of 70s jazz fusion, but it's my take on how to fuse our improvisation tradition with these folk traditions.
Cool. Hey, talk a little bit about your show today at the Kahilu Theatre and the trio that you brought along with you. This interview will run after your show has already been done, but folks that are watching this that haven't seen your show at the Kahilu Theatre, what can they look forward to?
Okay, great. Yeah, so I love these guys that are in my band. They're my friends. The bass player, I've been playing with him since 1994. We kind of grew up together. He's from New Zealand. His name is Matt Penman. He's probably the greatest jazz musician in the history of New Zealand. And as I was discussing with Chuck earlier, Hawaii and New Zealand are connected, in part for indigenous, cultural reasons, and also because this town feels like a town in New Zealand. It's very. As soon as we drove through, Matt was like, "Oh, I feel like I'm at home."
Wow.
Which is really
nice.
Really interesting.
Yeah.
He said, "Where are the sheep?" The only days.
Well, they're down the road.
They're down the road. Okay. So it's been special for us to go on tour in Hawaii. I mean, it's kind of a dream to go on tour and just have to fly half-an-hour flights every day from beach town to beach town, and it doesn't really get better. I've had to, it took me 30 years to do this tour, but I'm glad you're here. Glad that Matt could come along. He brought his family along as well.
Sweet.
Mark Whitfield is an amazing young drummer. He comes from a long tradition. His father is the Mark Whitfield Sr., great guitar player, jazz guitar player, who I listened to as a kid when I was growing up and admired and always aspired to play with. And so he grew up, he was born into it.
I read that he got his start on Good Morning America at the age of 4.
I mean, he was definitely playing gigs from the age of 3. When I have another friend who grew up in a similar way. He's a drummer, father was a jazz musician, and I watched him bring up his kids, and his kids would come to our concerts and they would sleep under the bass drum when they were 1, 2 years old. They get sleepy, 7. He'd be bashing away. The kids would, it's just normal. It's what your dad does.
What a great start.
Mark grew up like that, playing with his dad as soon as he was old enough to hold the drumsticks. And I was not fortunate enough to grow up with a family like that, but it does rub off. He's a first generation speaker of the language, or native speaker of this language, because he grew up hearing it all the time. Jazz was his first language before English.
Sweet.
Yeah, so then that rubs off. He has an effortlessness that anyone that comes to the show will notice.
Yeah.
It makes it all seem really easy.
What's the rest of this year look like for you? Have you got any new recordings coming out? Are you going back in the studio? Or?
Yeah, so I have a trio that I've been working with. I have a couple different trios. This is one of them. I have a trio with some friends that I've been working with, since the early '90s as well, and that's called the Yes Trio. So we have a tour coming up in Europe for about a month. And then I have my original trio, which I started in 1997 with 2 dear friends of mine, also my generation, Reuben Rogers and Eric Harland. So they're both pretty well-known guys themselves. They're both busy playing with, Joshua Redman and Charles Lloyd and a lot of other bands. But we came together in late '90s, and we stayed together for about 20 years. We took a break for the past 7 years, and we just made a new album. So we're going to have a reunion.
That's coming out this year.
It's coming out probably at the end of the summer, and then we'll try to tour in the fall.
Okay, we'll be on the lookout for it.
Thank you.
Where can folks go on the internet to find your music, to either buy it or download it? What's the best place to start?
Yeah, so of course it's there on Spotify, it's there on Apple Music, anywhere you might stream, you can find it there. And then I have a website, aarongoldberg.com. You can see what we're up to there. And of course, we exist on social media, Instagram, etc. It's a new world out there. People used to buy CDs and buy music. Now it's a win-lose proposition for us. I mean, it's a win because it's so easy for people to hear our music. Yeah. And more people than ever can access it for free. YouTube, which is great because we do want people to enjoy, and we're here providing a service as well as an art. On the other hand, it was nice to actually make money off making recordings. So, streaming hasn't worked out for jazz musicians the way it has worked out maybe for, Taylor Swift or Beyonce or somebody on that level. When you're getting millions and millions and millions of streams every hour, it pays. Yeah. For us, it's just an opportunity to really spread our music and our art form.
It's a good start.
And it's great especially for young people. They can just wow, what is jazz about? They don't have to save up money and go like I did. I had to save for a month to go get a $20 CD. That was, but on the other hand, it was big money. But on the other hand, when you get it, you treasure it and you listen to it over and over and over and over and over. So that's another piece of advice for young people. Don't get distracted by the next thing. Like if you really want to learn anything about any kind of music, the best thing to do is listen over and over and over and over to the same piece of music till it becomes a part of you. That's how we, came up listening to music. That's how we fell in love with this music.
Well, Aaron, thank you so much for your time
Steve.
today.
Pleasure.
And welcome to the Kahilu Theatre, and looking forward to your show.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Pleasure to talk to you.
Great.
If you enjoy the Songs and Stories podcast, we'd love for you to subscribe, rate, and give a review on iTunes. Be sure to visit bigislandmusic.net to join the conversation, access the show notes, and discover our fantastic bonus content. Now, back to the show.
Thanks for listening to the Songs and Stories podcast. Make sure you never miss a show by clicking the subscribe button now. This podcast is made possible by listeners like you. Thank you for your support. We'll see you next week on Songs and Stories. Aloha.